Hi, everybody. Welcome once again to Philosopher Meets Critics. This event is hosted, as usual, by the University of Cologne and the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. I'm Paul Silva. I'm a junior professor here at the University of Cologne, and I'll be hosting today's event. And I'm quite pleased to have the opportunity to introduce you all to Robin McKenna and his book, Non-Ideal Epistemology. Robin is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool and a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. Took his PhD from Edinburgh, and he's the author of dozens of articles in epistemology with an emphasis on social epistemology. His recent work has engaged with the psychology of belief formation, the ethics of science communication, the psychology of influence, and also the sociology of knowledge. Again, we're quite pleased to have him with us today. Florencia Rimoldi is our first critic. Florencia holds a PhD from the University of Buenos Aires, where she is a philosophy professor as well. She's an associate research fellow at CONICET, and her teaching and research areas include social and individual epistemology and legal epistemology. She's published several research articles in international journals on topics ranging from the norms of inquiry and conversation to testimony and non-ideal reasons for belief, and has also worked on assessing testimony and evidential sources in law. Ian James Kidd is our next commentator. He's an associate professor at the University of Nottingham, took his PhD from Durham, and is the author of a very, very large number of papers in philosophy, and his current work addresses topics such as misanthropy, pessimism, epistemic virtues and vices, illness and mortality, as well as themes in Buddhist and classical Chinese philosophy. Though his total body of published work includes addresses topics in aesthetics, ethics, philosophy of education, philosophy of science, and many other areas as well. Aidan McGlynn is our final commentator. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, took his PhD from UT Austin. His primary area of research is in epistemology and is the author of the first book-length opposition to knowledge first epistemology. It's called Knowledge First with a question mark at the end. And it's a great book. I highly recommend it to listeners. His current research is on issues at the intersection of epistemology and philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, and social and feminist philosophy. So those are our critics. Robin is, again, our author. And so Robin's going to kick us off with a summary of his work, and then the commentators will weigh in, and the conversation will take off from there. So thank you all once again for joining us. Please, Robin, take it away.
Okay, thanks. So I'm starting with this very low-res version of an image, the front cover of the book that I seem to like quite a lot, perhaps more than the actual contents of the book. So what I thought I'd do here is just do four things. So first of all, explain at a very high level what the book means by non-ideal epistemology. And then I'm going to comment on three parts of the book, the three parts that are most relevant to the commentators that are going to follow this up. So I'll talk about institutional epistemology, what I mean by that, what I say about intellectual autonomy, and what I say about epistemic agency and responsibility. So first of all, non-ideal epistemology. So the starting point of the book and of the project more generally was that we're familiar with the idea of non-ideal theory in political philosophy, although of course there's lots of debate about the best way to understand it, but there's a kind of established literature about that. So the question was, what would non-ideal theory in epistemology be? So I was writing this starting 2019 into 2020. Obviously, social epistemology is a big thing. Presumably, non-ideal theory in epistemology would be a kind of social epistemology. But the question was, what do you have to add to social epistemology to get non-ideal epistemology? Because after all, as anyone who does it will know, some social epistemology looks very idealized, looks more like ideal theory than non-ideal theory. Just a side note, when I was actually writing the book, I wasn't really aware of the developing literature on idealization in formal epistemology. Thinking here, for example, of Dan Greco's book, Idealization in Epistemology, which was also published in 2023. long story short, I'm not really sure how closely related these discussions are, and certainly when I read Dan Greco's book, I found I didn't really disagree with that much of it, which suggests that kind of there's less of a disagreement here than you might initially have thought. Perhaps these two literatures are talking about ideal and non-ideal theory in different senses. Okay, anyway, my idea was whatever non-ideal epistemology is, it's a kind of social epistemology, and it's a kind of social epistemology that clearly was/is happening. So it wasn't a name for a movement that we should create. It was a name for a movement that was already happening, albeit not under the banner non-ideal epistemology. So essentially what I was trying to do was, if you like, bring together two bodies of literature. So the first body of literature was what I think of as a kind of recent development in naturalized epistemology, where epistemologists were engaging much more heavily with work in contemporary psychology. So it wasn't the kind of hand-wavy thing that Quine does in Epistemology Naturalized. It was a really serious engagement with contemporary psychology. That was the first thing. And the second thing was a few different names for it: feminist, critical epistemology. I assume you know the kinds of things I have in mind. So the idea was to bring these two things together and find a way of explaining what that was and calling that non-ideal epistemology. And the idea here was not meant to be in any way original. When you look at what some feminist epistemologists say about kind of where they're coming from theoretically, they're actually explicitly doing the exact same thing. So I'm thinking here of people like Elizabeth Anderson, Helen Longino, and most explicitly Lynn Nelson, who's got a book where she positions feminist epistemology as a kind of development of naturalized epistemology in the spirit of Quine. Okay, so let me just go into a bit more detail. What's the naturalized epistemology part? Well, I like the way that Hilary Cornbluth puts naturalized epistemology in an article, I think, from the 80s, where he says that basically the idea is that for a naturalized epistemologist, normative questions are constrained by descriptive questions about belief formation. So an answer to the question of how we should form beliefs is constrained by an answer to the question of how we in fact form beliefs, in the sense that the kind of justified ways of forming beliefs must be a subset of the actual ways in which we form beliefs. Beliefs are justified via the method, if they are justified at all, they're justified via the method by which they were actually produced, not some other method that we could have used instead. And of course, these questions have used the word we. We here could refer to an individual, so an individual naturalized epistemology, or it could refer to a group, a community, an institution, something like that. And that, of course, is the way in which Alvin Goldman arrived at social epistemology, essentially. So this gives us two dimensions of, if you like, non-ideality, to kind of ways in which we can talk about departing from ideals. First of all, we're foregrounding human cognitive limitations, such as susceptibility to various forms of bias. So kind of going beyond the kind of minimal assertion of human fallibility, but documenting the ways in which we're not just fallible creatures, but deeply biased creatures. And second, limitations in what you might call the information or epistemic environment. So the prevalence of lying, deceit, falsehoods, various forms of misinformation, and so on. Plus, of course, the simple fact that when we rely on others, we're relying on other agents who are limited in certain respects, much as we are. So those are the two dimensions of, if you like, non-ideality that you can take from naturalized epistemology. Now, in Charles Mills's much discussed and read nowadays article, Why Ignorance, at the very beginning of that, he has a kind of, I don't know, critique of social epistemology that unfolds in about 2 paragraphs, and it's all very grand, and it leaves a lot of things unsaid. But there's this very nice passage, I think, where he explains what he sees as the good things, but also the bad things about Alvin Goldman's particular program in social epistemology. I'm not going to read out the whole quote on the slide, but I guess I'll talk for long enough so that those of you following at home can basically read it. Basically, what Mills is saying here is that Goldman acknowledges that human beings rely on each other, they exist in a society. There are these institutions that structure the society. But just like Mill sees this problem with ideal theory in political philosophy, where you work with a very idealized picture of the society, Mills thinks Goldman is essentially doing the same thing in social epistemology. So he is taking it that the, if you like, epistemic function of these institutions is to produce true belief or knowledge. But for Mills, of course, he wants to say, well, actually, no, when you look at certain social institutions, actually it seems more like they were designed to produce ignorance. This is why the article is called White Ignorance, and then he gives his story of white ignorance. So basically, Mills is criticizing Goldman's social epistemology for being idealized in the ways in which Mills thinks that ideal theory in the Rawlsian vein is idealized. So what you can take from this is kind of generally the need to work with a more realistic picture of the social environment in which humans operate, and more specifically, two further dimensions of non-ideality. First or third, the role that power dynamics, such as differentials in social power and status, play in shaping that environment. So not everyone contributes equally to the environment, not everyone benefits equally from it, perhaps some are even excluded. Fourth or second, this is an environment with prevalent forms of injustice and oppression, often with a long, complicated history that explains the kind of present state of the environment, and these injustices and forms of oppression have often been, in fact, been aided and abetted by social institutions. Okay, so that's what I take from Mills's critique of Goldman's social epistemology. But what Mills is doing in his critique is saying, well, look, Goldman's definitely onto something here, because we need a social epistemology. We just don't need an idealized social epistemology. We need a non-ideal social epistemology. So essentially what the book does, insofar as it explains what I mean by non-ideal epistemology, is it just goes into a lot more detail about what Mills was driving at. Basically, non-ideal epistemology aims to do what Mills says that Goldman's social epistemology should be doing, but is in fact not doing. That's the basic idea. Okay, so that's my attempt to explain what I mean by non-ideal epistemology. So the book, the first two chapters of the book are mostly devoted to that task, and there's other stuff in there, but that's the kind of the main aim of those chapters. Then the rest of the book does, well, four things, three of which I'm going to say some more about right now. So the first of those things is develop a non-ideal brand of institutional epistemology. I'll talk about that in a second. The second is, alongside that, say some things about intellectual autonomy that I know that some people don't like very much. Third, give a kind of socially situated way of thinking about epistemic agency and responsibility. And the final thing is talk about a kind of skepticism that I think arises in non-ideal epistemology. But I'll not go into that here because none of the commentators wanted to focus on that. So let me just start with institutional epistemology. So again, that's the focus of chapters 3 and 4, and also in a way chapter 5, although that's doing something else too. So the basic question I was grappling with here is this. How should science communicators, so those that are tasked with communicating science to the public, how should they go about their task, given that they find themselves in a non-ideal environment, if you like, where there is widespread scientific ignorance, downright skepticism, lack of trust in scientific institutions, and so on. So that was the question that I was addressing here. And what I was doing essentially was exploring this basic answer, which you find in the science communication literature itself, which is that the right way to go about this is to identify a set of strategies that you have reason to think will work, where work means bring about a change in attitude on the relevant scientific issues, towards the attitude you want people to have. So, for example, thinking that climate change is a serious threat, and to bring about that change in attitude not via indoctrination or anything really nefarious, but rather by kind of curating a set of arguments, a set of reasons that you think will persuade people of the truth of those attitudes. So what I do in the book is I say, well, look, okay, what these people are doing, they're doing science. They're saying, well, let's try out some strategies. Let's gather some statistical data. Let's see which strategies bring about measurable change in attitude. But of course, just because a strategy will work doesn't mean you're permitted to use it. If brainwashing were effective, it wouldn't be permissible. And what's interesting about the kinds of strategies that science communicators tend to talk about is they're sort of in a kind of grey borderland between kind of simple cases of rational persuasion and things that look a bit more manipulative. Essentially, what you're doing is you're crafting a message that you think will be persuasive. You're doing a kind of advertising, but what you're trying to sell isn't a commercial product, it's science. But you're viewing science as a product that you want to sell by adverting to its benefits, the reasons that speak in favor of it, something like that. So what I do is that I argue that some common strategies that are put forward in this literature, like pre-bunking, for example, are permissible because even though they might look like they constitute a form of paternalism, that form is typically permissible. But part of the reason why it's permissible, I want to say, is that this is part of a relatively limited program for, if you like, advertising science. So I draw a contrast between what science communicators are doing, where they want to, I don't know, create the situations for acceptance of a very narrow set of ideas, with what, for example, people that like nudges, like in the sense of Thaler and Sunstein, put forward. So Thaler and Sunstein talk about what they call the beneficent nudging program, which is a kind of systematic way of trying to move around people's attitudes, but that's not what science communication is talking about. It's rather a far narrower set of strategies intended to achieve a far narrower set of ends. Okay, it's fair to say I've changed my view about some things since I wrote the book, but Aidan and also actually Florencia will be pushing me on this, so I'll not preempt their comments here. Okay, second thing, intellectual autonomy. So chapter 5 is about intellectual autonomy, but that's partly in the context of this ongoing discussion of the ethics and epistemology, if you like, of science communication. So the kind of basic context in the book is I'm asking the question of whether we should be worried that these science communication strategies might look like they in some way infringe on intellectual autonomy. And the answer I want to give here is no, we shouldn't be that worried about this. And again, that's partly because of the relatively limited scope of these science communication strategies. The basic idea was that intellectual autonomy is a capacity, so kind of one-off interventions in someone's inquiry doesn't necessarily threaten it, especially when those interventions might look like they are justifiable on other grounds, or it's hard to avoid some kind of intervention. The question is just what form that should take. But anyway, intellectual autonomy, also a focus of chapter 5. So the basic view that I defend in this chapter is that intellectual autonomy, at least as some understand it, I'll back to that in a second, is overrated. Why? Well, the basic argument is this. There's often a tension between two goals you might have, believing the truth and being intellectually autonomous. So that is, sometimes the more intellectually autonomous you are, the less likely you are to believe the truth. And I think that in a wide range of situations, believing the truth, that's more important than intellectual autonomy. So the claim is not that in all situations it's more important. The claim is just that in some or many situations it isn't more important. So in those situations, we shouldn't be too worried about intellectual autonomy. Okay. One thing that is really important to this chapter, and I think hopefully is sufficiently clear in the book, is what I am doing is trying to show that on what I call modest conceptions of intellectual autonomy, these claims hold. So I'm not arguing with someone who thinks that intellectual autonomy means complete self-reliance. That's not a very popular view in contemporary social epistemology. I'm arguing with some authors who think that intellectual autonomy involves what you might call a kind of discerning difference. And I'm arguing that this thing is overrated. So my argument roughly, again, is that in a wide range of contexts, difference isn't, maybe even can't be particularly discerning. Why? Because we typically choose from pre-selected options, kind of narrow set of experts from which we can choose, and our selections between that narrow set of experts, they often reflect our existing biases more than anything else. So while it's a kind of difference, it's not a particularly discerning kind of difference. So that's not intellectual autonomy understood as discerning difference. It's just difference, rather undiscerning, you might say. So let me just try and make this more concrete using one of the examples that I use in the book. So let's imagine you have to choose between competing experts on a question such as what to do about climate change, or to use an example that wasn't quite so salient when I started writing the book, but was very salient by the end. Different experts who have competing views about how to behave during a pandemic. So the claims I make in the book, or the claim I make in the book, is that we typically don't go out looking for potential experts. Rather, they are presented to us via the kind of normal media institutions. And those experts that are presented to us typically represent a fairly narrow range of opinions. And then we choose between those experts based on fit, either with what we already think, or if we don't have a kind of settled view, perceived fit with our values. So, I don't know what I think about this issue, but here's this person who says they're an expert, and I can see that we share values or political ideology, so I'll go with that person. So the claim I'm making in this chapter is the best way to improve those choices would be to make the options better, or to make the best options more salient, rather than to try as an individual to be more discerning, or if you like, to be more intellectually autonomous, where intellectual autonomy is understood as discerning difference. Again, I think it's fair to say I've changed my mind about some of these issues since writing the book. But one thing that hopefully was clear in the book, at least it was clear in my mind when I was writing it, perhaps it wasn't clear in the writing itself. The argument of chapter 5 is against the particular conceptions of intellectual autonomy I discuss, not a different kind of way of thinking of it, where essentially you try to socialize it. You don't try to understand intellectual autonomy at the level of the individual, but rather at the level of the collective. So I meant the argument of chapter 5 to be entirely consistent with that more socialized way of thinking about it. And in fact, that actually leads on to the next bit and chapters 6 and 7. So what chapters 6 and 7 do, this is me now on epistemic agency and responsibility, is they look in more detail at epistemic agency, right? So the first part was this institutional thing, so individuals almost get lost, but the idea was that in non-ideal epistemology, individuals don't get lost. They just need to be understood in a social context. They have to be socially situated, to use the jargon from the feminist epistemology literature. So the question was, what does intellectual virtue require in a non-ideal world? In brackets on the slide there, part of what it might require is just a socialized form of intellectual autonomy. So my agenda here was partly to emphasize something that I thought was very important to the argument of the book as a whole, which is that it's a mistake to view non-ideal epistemology as somehow less demanding than ideal epistemology. And that's in part why chapter 7 focuses on Jose Medina's version of virtue epistemology, which is meant to be non-ideal, but is also very demanding. So simple version of chapter 6, very quickly, it argues that a virtuous person need not always be open to the possibility that they're wrong. So it's kind of an argument against the kind of open-mindedness. I'll not get into that here because nobody in the comments wanted to focus on it. Chapter 7, that will be the focus of Ian's comments. Chapter 7 argues that Jose Medina gives us a helpful way of showing how epistemic responsibilities can be divided up in a society. So Medina's basic picture, as I interpret it, is that we need to have a kind of social division of epistemic responsibilities. So you've got this job, I've got those jobs, someone else has got these other jobs, and so on. So Medina's picture is that we've all got certain basic responsibilities as virtue of being members of this society, but some social roles get particularly weighty or just special responsibilities. So an example that he talks about and that I use because it links up with epistemic injustice literature is that a juror in a jury trial has got responsibilities to be unbiased when they're being a juror that go far beyond what can reasonably be expected of someone. You know, there's no reason why a juror needs to be particularly able to avoid biases influencing their thinking. But the point is just that when you're a juror, that is what's expected of you, even if you're not particularly well placed to do it. So Medina's idea is that it makes sense to say that the juror is responsible for not being biased, even if they're actually quite prone to certain kinds of biases. So there's a different way of thinking about responsibility, where it's not about your character, it's about the social role that you occupy in this division of responsibilities. So you might say, isn't that very demanding? Demanding in precisely the way I criticize ideal epistemology for being in certain parts of the book. But then my response here is that there's not a problem with having demanding norms and demanding expectations. What matters is whether, when non-ideal people try to live up to those norms or expectations, they get closer to or further away the goals that we have. So I think that demanding expectations and norms are a problem when they take us further away, but they're not a problem when they get us closer. So I think that Medina's demanding set of norms, there's no reason to think will take us further away from where we want to be. Whereas in other parts of the book, I criticize ideal epistemology for having demanding norms that take us too far away. But the problem is not demanding this, the problem is they take us in the wrong direction. Okay, I'll stop there, thanks.
Florencia, you're up, thank you.
So again, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I'll go right into the comment. I'll share my slides and I'll start. Okay. So in chapter 5, McKenna poses a challenge to modest notions of intellectual autonomy. And if he is right, then we often shouldn't strive to be autonomous. His strategy is depicted at the beginning of the chapter and has 3 interlocked claims. The first one, I called it unattainability, is the idea that intellectual autonomy is an epistemic ideal or goal that many of us frequently and predictably fall short of. The second one is frustration. I named it that way. It is an epistemic goal that often frustrates our other epistemic goals in the sense that in striving to attain it, we run the risk of not achieving these other often more valuable goals. And from this, you have like this conclusion, a conditional unworthiness, which is that in the absence of a reason for thinking that intellectual autonomy is more important, we often do better not to strive for it. So here I will focus on the reasons provided by McKenna for unattainability and frustration for Carter's 2020 account of modest autonomy, which is centered on the idea of self-direction. I will try to show that Carter's position can resist McKenna's arguments. I believe that in the end, arguing against this notion would involve a more straightforward discussion on the value and the proper interpretation of self-direction, and also if there is a better understanding of autonomy than the one discussed here. So, according to Carter, the virtuously autonomous agent must rely on others and outsource cognitive tasks as a means to gaining knowledge and other epistemic goods, up until the point that doing so would be at the expense of her own capacity for self-direction. So this is not radical autonomy or complete self-reliance, since it involves outsourcing and relying on other people, not only for getting information, but also for shaping the direction of our inquiries. An autonomous virtuous character, in the sense above, is someplace between complete independence and blind trust. For Carter, the limit for deference and outsourcing is a loss of the capacity for self-direction. And this means an individual, I'm quoting here, that acquires through deferential and extra-agential means an impressive knowledge base, but lacks the crucial capacity to assess on the basis of this information what further inquiries should be pursued without extra-agential assistance. So this is the thing that this virtue avoids. This is the limit. So, and it is consistent, with the present proposal that the mark of autonomous inquiries is self-direction, even if it only means asking a person or Google a specific question. It only excludes things like passively consuming media reports without even asking the proper questions. So my first comment is against the first claim, unattainability. So the strategy for unattainability is to first describe a case that Carter himself uses as an example of inquiries in which autonomy is severely jeopardized. The second step is to show that the relevant features of that case are much more common than what Carter suggests. If this is so, then autonomy is usually unattainable. So the case taken from Carter is this one. I'm going to read it. You make an online choice, for example, between 5 options which turn up in a Yelp search about what activity to pursue when visiting a new town. In such a circumstance, you might believe the choice you make best represents your own preferences. You then search again to learn some more information about the specific activity, and are in the process nudged by Google autocomplete, which generates another choice from a menu. At the end of such a series, your curiosity is satisfied and your inquiry is complete. It is an interesting philosophical question to what extent you have just directed the particular chain of inquiries which have culminated in the new set of ellipses you've settled upon. This much seems plausible. The shape that online inquiry chains take is significantly influenced by undetected framing effects that are themselves the product of upstream technological design decisions. So this is the case, and let's call it a non-autonomous web inquiry. McKenna follows up on this with this idea. In this example, a form of cognitive outsourcing reduces your control over the direction of your inquiry and so infringes on your intellectual autonomy. So here I want to say 2 things. First, it is important to notice that the problem with this case cannot be, as McKenna implies in that quotation, the fact that your control over the direction of your inquiry is merely reduced. Modest autonomy must allow for different degrees of control. Otherwise, it collapses with radical autonomy, where the dialectic is total control or none. So the problem for Carter in non-autonomous web inquiries is a different one, is that the subject outsources the inquiry entirely to menu-driven apps, up to a point that the salient explanation for its shape, direction, and beliefs that serve as determination is technological design rather than the individual, the subject. I'm basically quoting Carter here. Another issue I just want to leave, like the question, is whether we could describe non-autonomous web inquiry as a good inquiry. We would need further details and discussion, but I just wanted to say that the answer is not so clear to me. Now, what interests McKenna the most is the potential generalization of this situation. At this point, he takes Sunstein and Thaler's well-known claim that choice architecture is everywhere. And choice architecture works precisely by arranging the information we have at our disposal and influencing the directions of our inquiries. This implies, according to McKenna, that choice architects exert the same type of unnoticed control over our inquiries than the case of web designers in non-autonomous web inquiries. So we are, most of our times, in the same predicament as non-autonomous web inquiry. This forces the advocates of modest autonomy to accept that our intellectual autonomy is compromised whenever we enter physical or virtual spaces that have been designed by choice architects. This is the argument. So what I want to say here are two things. First, as I said before, I don't think that on Carter's conception, a mere reduction of control implies that self-direction is lost. Choice architecture and framing effects show for sure that our environment is arranged in a way that reduces our capacity for self-direction. But we need more to claim something like unattainability. For doing so, McKenna needs to show that the reduction of the control we have over our inquiries amounts to the loss of self-direction, which is involved in non-autonomous web inquiry, in which the salient explanation of its direction, shape, and result is design and architecture. But I don't think that this is the case in general and in web inquiries in particular. I mean, certainly our environment pushes toward that way. Sometimes we do it with an unauthentic feeling of property on the choices we make and the information we get. And other times we do it knowingly and willfully, letting our inquiries be taken over by the algorithm. In such cases, we put our decisions and processes of belief formation in the hand of external sources, which cannot in any sense be described as ours. And this only, I wanted to say that having a false feeling of authenticity is not the mark to me of not being autonomous. But I don't know if I did this in a clear way, but so a second thing is, or no, that these things are related. On other times, we don't just look at the first 4 options of a Google search. We scroll down and enter multiple sources or websites with different designs or frames. We look carefully at the website's credentials. We don't let Google autocomplete our searches because we don't want to get distracted. We want to know about an issue and not a similar but unrelated one. And when I enter non-virtual design space, I can do the same thing. Even when I am fully aware of the influence of intentional design or architecture, my inquiry is well satisfied and its shape, direction, and termination is due to myself sufficiently. This is not saying that designs don't have a part in the explanation, but they are not the salient part of it. So in my opinion, even if non-autonomous web inquiry is a phenomenon that is quite real and quite prominent inside and outside the web, nothing in the notion of modest autonomy implies that we are not up to the challenge when we try to. So being autonomous might be hard, but it's not that hard. That's the first idea. And so now I want to focus on frustration. So the strategy, the argument for frustration takes the following form. First, the idea that autonomy is unattainable in design spaces, what he argued earlier. Second, that striving to attain it would imply avoiding those spaces. Third, the idea that those spaces, of course, represent an immense part of our sources of meaningful information and knowledge, which are valuable epistemic goals. Therefore, striving to be autonomous often frustrates our other valuable epistemic goals. As he says, striving to attain intellectual autonomy is often actively harmful to our overall epistemic situation. So the first two claims are connected with what I said earlier. So I don't think that striving to attain autonomy would imply avoiding those spaces. But my concern here is a different one. For McKenna's argument to work, another premise is at work. And this premise is also required for other ways for arguing for frustration, such as showing, for instance, that striving to be autonomous is not reliable. That, we haven't considered that, the idea of the reliability of autonomy, of trying to think in an autonomous way. But I think this applies as well to that strategy. Frustration is supported by the claim that if one does not strive to be autonomous, then one actually gets knowledge and true beliefs from those sources of information. That we could navigate our informational spaces without self-direction and still get some valuable information and knowledge. This means particularly that in cases such as non-autonomous web inquiries, when the salient explanation of the shape, direction, and termination of our inquiries is design and choice architecture, we end up nevertheless with true beliefs and knowledge that matter to us. So a few things here. So I don't think that this is the case in our actual epistemic environment. It might be that in non-autonomous web inquiries, we end up with pieces of information, but we can ask whether they are significant or they are irrelevant or are forgettable. I guess it depends on the case, but it's fair to say that on many occasions, we end up with irrelevant information. On other times, even if we end up with truths that matter to us, they would be dependent on intentional decisions that are not only heteronomous, but probably not in our best interest, but in the markets. And this is, to me, quite dangerous. This does not describe a good epistemic situation. On the other hand, on many highly important issues, misinformation, as McKenna shows, not only coexists, but overthrows information. There are billions of dollars invested in getting people to believe certain things or suspend judgment on others, such as climate change, vaccines, who are to be blamed on this or that economical or political situation. The epistemic environment in certain platforms, such as X, and now also Facebook and Instagram, is so polluted that many news outlets have stepped out of it. The fact that the fact-checking program of Facebook and Instagram exists no more has been described as an extinction-level event for truth on social media. So my question is, what are the chances that someone who lets web design and choice architecture take over her inquiries on these issues ends up with true beliefs and knowledge? All these considerations revolve on the idea that architecture is guided by the market or by the explicit intention to mislead in a high proportion. Added to this, motivated reasoning and cultural cognition will still be operative. So not striving to be autonomous would not produce true information and knowledge in a consistent or reliable way. This puts some pressure on the idea that the search for autonomy actually frustrates other epistemic goals. There's nothing good in our epistemic situation when we stop looking for autonomy. If McKenna is correct in his diagnosis about the unattainability of autonomy, then the consequence to me is much more pessimistic. Whatever we do, our epistemic environment is such that knowledge and true beliefs are much less common than we have initially thought of. And this conclusion takes the burden out of autonomy's back, and puts it in our epistemic environment. Now, maybe McKenna is interested in the frustration of epistemic goals when design is well-intentioned and has a respect for truth, such as nudges in nutrition, health, and the like. Letting these designs take over our inquiries would produce knowledge or true beliefs. I have my doubts on this issue. First, because I don't think that nudges can work without the person taking over further inquiries on her own. The information they provide is not by itself good or actionable knowledge. Second, because as Ginger has argued, good and effective nudges require more than merely discerning people's true needs and preferences. And those requirements are hard to obtain. But in any case, good and effective nudges are a very small part of our actual designed informational space. And with this last comment, I finish. So, what about possible worlds in which measures are taken to promote the formation of true beliefs and knowledge? For instance, those proposed by McKenna in chapter 4. Should we strive to be autonomous then? That's a highly important question for non-ideal institutional epistemology. But it is a different question. And for answering it, we should contrast that scenario, that sort of interventions, with a different one, in which measures have been taken to facilitate that people genuinely exercise their autonomous capacities in a truth-conducive way. We should discuss what interventions are better for promoting a healthy epistemic environment. This discussion has, of course, an empirical side, the plausibility of these measures, but it would also be partially led by topics like the epistemic value of self-direction and different interpretations of autonomy, which is something that McKenna has tried to leave apart from the discussion. So I'd love to know what he thinks about all this.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Robin, please go ahead. You're muted.
Not anymore, I hope. Thank you, Florencia. Yeah, I was going to start by saying a bunch of stuff about why I'm interested in choice architecture in the first place and how this links back to the science communication stuff, but I'll not do that because I think I spoke for a bit too long with the overview. I'll just go into the more direct responses to some of your questions, Florencia. So, okay, well, let me start with what you said about what you call unattainability. So my claim that intellectual autonomy is often unattainable. So it seems like you agree with me that because choice architecture is ubiquitous, both online and offline, intellectual autonomy is often infringed upon, perhaps to such an extent that it isn't really attained. So when I conduct an inquiry, I type a question to Google and I just quickly read the AI summary that pops up. There's not really a good sense in which I'm exhibiting any intellectual autonomy, and we do that kind of thing a lot. But your point is that hardly means that intellectual autonomy is unattainable, right? So the fact that something is often not attained doesn't in any way imply it's unattainable. And of course, I could quite easily go into Google right now, type in a query, but then look at the results in a much more careful way, browse a few pages, decide which ones are worth paying more attention to, and spend a few hours on that procedure. And that looks like that's me exerting my intellectual autonomy because I'm exerting this kind of real control over my inquiry. So I agree with you that all of this is perfectly possible. I also agree with something that you say at one point, which is that, well, it seems like the situations in which you will exert more effort, they're the situations where something actually matters to you, right? So if you don't particularly care about the inquiry or the outcome to it, you might kind of conduct it in a very cursory fashion and just kind of do what the choice architects intended, so to speak. But if it actually matters to you, right, like, I don't know, you want to decide whether to vaccinate your child, and you really care about that, the chances are you're going to try and exert more control over it. So I agree with all that. And maybe one of the problems is that in the chapter, I separate out Adam Carter's view from Roberts and Wood. Was it Robert Roberts and is it Jay Wood? I forget their names anyway. I separate these two views out and discuss them separately. But as you point out, I think Adam is kind of, he takes his view, that is Adam Carter, he takes his view to be kind of building on theirs. So when I discuss Roberts and Wood, I think the argumentative strategy is a little bit different. So the point I want to make there is that intellectual autonomy can't just be a capacity to direct your inquiries, because that wouldn't be a virtue, right? To be a virtue, it has to, I don't know, if you kind of follow a certain kind of virtue epistemology and probably the kind they like, to be a virtue, it has to manifest concern for truth or accuracy. Something like that, kind of out of a love of knowledge, that kind of thing. So if you've got that conception of intellectual autonomy as a virtue, then yeah, you can't conclude from the fact that someone takes control of their inquiry that they're manifesting intellectual autonomy, because there's not necessarily the bit that makes it a virtue in there, the concern for truth. So when I discuss Roberts and Wood, I think one way of thinking about what I'm doing there is I'm saying that a lot of the time, even though we exert this kind of control over inquiries, us doing so doesn't necessarily manifest concern with truth or accuracy. So another way of putting it would be that if intellectual autonomy is discerning deference, then the deference is often not that discerning. So this is kind of going back to some things that I said in my overview. So you might think that a lot of the time when someone conducts an inquiry, for example, into some politically contentious matter, what they do essentially is spend a lot of time compiling a bunch of sources that confirms what they already think, or at least what they would like to think, or what they're doing is not so much figuring out what's true as figuring out what those in their social group think. And that can take quite a lot of time, and it can involve exerting quite a lot of effort, and it can involve being very selective, right? You go into Google and you're looking for something to justify your inclination to not vaccinate your child. You'll spend a lot of time finding the right sources. So you're exerting control over it. You're not just going along with the algorithm at all. But you might think this deference doesn't seem to be motivated by a concern for truth or accuracy. Rather, it's more like a concern for justifying your existing opinions or your inclinations. So it's kind of confirmation bias driven inquiry, something like that. So that, I think, is the kind of argument I wanted to have against intellectual autonomy and the attainability of it. But of course, that argument wouldn't show that intellectual autonomy is impossible. At most, it would show that for some people in certain contexts, it's very hard to attain because there's this standing temptation to engage in this kind of motivated inquiry. What I wanted to say in the chapter wasn't that intellectual autonomy is unattainable in general. It's that in certain contexts, it's hard to attain. And that's meant to be a reason why we shouldn't worry so much about the fact that some ways in which science communicators might try to persuade people might look like it kind of infringes on intellectual autonomy. It's not there in the first place, something like that. Okay, so frustration. So there's quite a lot of overlap between what you said there and what Aidan's going to say. And I've got a response to him prepared. And I wrote that first. So my response to you, and trying not to just copy what I say to Aidan. So I guess what I'll do is, you want to know about the big picture. So I guess I'll give my answer about the big picture, which means I can't really respond to the more specific questions. It's kind of the big picture that I think I've got. So the book, I think it's fair to say, defends a picture that's quite a lot like the picture Neil Levy has defended in his work, if anyone knows that. So Neil Levy's picture, I think, is that in good epistemic environments, striving for intellectual autonomy can go against the goal of having true beliefs, and that's why we shouldn't strive for it. But Neil also thinks that in bad environments, humans, we're not very prone to intellectual autonomy, and we're not really very good at it. So you also shouldn't try and be autonomous in the bad environments either. You should kind of defer in all kinds of environments. It's just that in the good environments, your deference gets you true beliefs, whereas in the bad environments, it doesn't. But you should always be deferring. I think that's his picture. My book hasn't got the second bit because I'm focusing on the good environments. But I think my picture there is very similar to his. And I think I don't necessarily disagree with that picture now, but I think it's important to note that by good environments, I'm not really talking about like global environments, I'm talking about local environments, so kind of information environment with respect to some particular issue. And I'm also not talking about like environments for everyone, it's more kind of the environment for a person. So the claim I'm making is that if you are in an environment that is good for you relative to some particular issue, in that environment, you shouldn't worry so much about intellectual autonomy and trying to be intellectually autonomous. And that's the kind of the argument about frustration. But of course, the environment might be bad for you, might be bad in this particular respect, or you might be in a kind of bad environment more generally. And I don't think there's anything in the book that says that you shouldn't be worried about intellectual autonomy there. And more generally, I'd be inclined to say that it's in those kinds of situations that you should be maybe caring more about intellectual autonomy. But I still don't think that the way to think about intellectual autonomy is in terms of you as an individual exerting control over your inquiry. I think the right way to do it is to think about intellectual autonomy, if it is a thing at all, as arising at the level of a collective, where that collective is essentially in the business of creating a better epistemic environment. So within the context of that collective, individuals might have something like intellectual autonomy, but that's just a very different way of thinking about it. So I do want to reject kind of Adam Carter's conception, where it seems to be very individualistic. Kind of, you have to kind of manage to find a way of extricating yourself from your environment and kind of directing things. That's not the way in which I want to think about it. But I do want to say that in those kinds of contexts, intellectual autonomy, differently conceived, can be valuable. And I'll say more about that in response to Aidan's comments. Hopefully that was not too high level.
Excellent. Thank you, Robin. Why don't we now take a break? Just 3-4 minutes, 4 or 5, and
Sounds good.
Come back. All right, Aidan, you're up. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. I'm going to be talking about, I think, some similar issues, and perhaps some of Robin's comments are going to pick up again on some of the things he's just been saying. Sorry, I don't have any control over this. So I read Robin's book expecting I would enjoy it and get a lot out of it, which I did. And I also expected to agree with most of it, which I didn't. Robin and I have had kind of similar backgrounds, sometimes overlapping backgrounds in epistemology and in the kind of institutions we've studied epistemology at. And I think we've had kind of what I thought is similar trajectories away from mainstream epistemology into other kind of more applied and issues in kind of feminist epistemology and other kinds of issues like that. And I just agreed with the book a lot less than I expected to, in ways which I found really interesting. So I think if it had just been the book that I imagined it was going to be, which was kind of laying out in a lot more detail and with a lot more care than anything I'd thought of, kind of what I was already doing. I think that's a lot less interesting than the book we actually got from Robin. So I found it very interesting and productive to think about where there are kind of differences between where we've landed. And the initial disagreement I had with it was very similar to the one discussed in the last talk. So it concerned intellectual autonomy. And I want to kind of concede a couple of points which have already come up. So one thing is I don't want to hang on to anything like the notion of autonomy that Locke seemed to have in his discussions of testimony, the idea that when somebody else tells you something, it just kind of, that belief rattles around in your brain, but doesn't really contribute at all to what you can know, what you can understand, what beliefs you should have, or the kind of radical independence from everyone else that Kant seemed to think was some kind of ideal of the Enlightenment. So as Robin said in his introduction, I think pretty much every social epistemologist wants to junk that nowadays. It just seems like that's not really doing social epistemology. I also, and maybe this is the difference to the talk before, I tend to agree it's very hard to see how we can have autonomy even in these more modest senses, like the kind of views that we've been talking about coming from Adam Carter and others. So these less demanding contemporary accounts, which are very much trying to locate themselves within social epistemology rather than trying to be very hyper-individualistic. So I agree those are difficult to have for much of the reasons that Robin gives in his book, and the way that we're kind of susceptible to nudging and kind of other kinds of forces. And the claim that I felt uncomfortable with was the idea that it's not even worth striving for, that it invariably means missing out on truth and knowledge, and that truth and knowledge is things that we should often value more than the supposed virtue of intellectual autonomy. So I think I agree it's hard to have, even in these modest senses, but I still kind of felt uncomfortable with the idea we shouldn't even be striving for it. And in trying to articulate why I had this reaction, I ended up, I think, pulling on that thread led me to other bigger disagreements with the kind of overall project of the book. So I'm going to talk a bit about those bigger disagreements. I'll relate them a bit to the distinction between non-ideal and ideal epistemology, and then I'll come back briefly to the value of autonomy, which I don't have much detail, so I'm going to try and give a kind of answer to a question that I find in Robin's book that I think he intended to be rhetorical about the value of autonomy, and I'll try and give an answer, but I don't have an account which improves on or even matches some of the accounts which are already in the literature, or the kind of account we talked about in the last talk. So here's, I think, the way to put the kind of big picture disagreement. I'm going to attribute to Robin some very oversimplified views. So this is not giving him any nuance pretty much at all. But I think to kind of try and bring out the disagreement in its starkest form, I'm not going to give myself much nuance either, for fairness sake. So the thought is that I take Robin to be committed to something like the following. Epistemically speaking, Robin, I think, combines a very, very thoroughgoing pessimism about individual epistemic agents with a kind of thoroughgoing optimism about institutions and the roles that those have in kind of shaping our epistemic environments. The pessimistic thought is that individuals don't exercise epistemic agency or autonomy nearly as often as we might like to think or credit ourselves with doing. Even when they do exercise epistemic agency, they're frequently responsive to the wrong kinds of considerations, and that leads them to form beliefs that are not justified or knowledgeable. So we're very susceptible to nudges, to engaging in motivated reasoning of the sort that Robin gave some examples of a moment ago. So that's the kind of pessimistic side. The optimistic side is that an inquiry epistemology in Kasim Kassam's sense, which is trying to make suggestions about how we might improve our epistemic practices, one that focuses on institutions and institutional changes, that can make realistic and effective proposals that can enable us to do collectively better, to get at epistemic goods more reliably. I think that optimistic thought subdivides, and when we make that division, we can see some issues with some of it. I think there's a kind of optimism that certain kinds of interventions made at an institutional level will be effective when they're carried out. So they'll lead people to truth and knowledge, they'll make our epistemic environments more productive in that sense. And then secondly, I think maybe slightly hidden in there is optimism that these are interventions that we're actually going to be in a position to carry out, where I take we to be quite expansive, so a kind of collective we. These are actually going to be interventions that we'll be in a position to make, will have that kind of influence on things. And I think the first part of the optimism is nicely argued for in Robin's book. So he mentioned earlier this example of science communication and effective strategies for that, which kind of pitch interventions at an institutional level rather than trying to focus on, say, giving advice to individuals about how they might pick out experts in the way that Alvin Goldman suggested. It's just much less clear to me why we should be optimistic in anything like the second sense. I think many institutions are epistemically hostile. They are designed to keep people ignorant, either through feeding them disinformation or through defeating their beliefs in various ways. And others, I think, might be seen as epistemically benevolent, as giving rise to productive epistemic environments as things stand, but where the benevolence is fragile. And I've got a kind of cartoon to give a decisive proof at this point on the next slide. So Googling stuff, an example that's already come up. The idea is Googling stuff back then in some indeterminate golden past, you just get the search results being the thing that you want. And nowadays, your search results are AI taking a wild stab at it with some blatant misinformation, a ton of sponsored results, some associated results, more product placement, and then way down at the bottom, you get the thing that you were looking for. This is actually an updated version of a cartoon that didn't have the stuff about AI at the top. This is a recent update of that cartoon to spell out things, ways things have gone even worse in the last while. So a pessimistic view about institutions in the relevant sense sees their epistemic benevolence as, in most cases, fragile at best. So it's not kind of well-founded, it's not grounded in anything, it's kind of, well, I'll say a bit more about what I mean by fragility. So these are institutions that improve our epistemic circumstances, they help us get truth and knowledge, while those in charge perceive it to be in their interests. And likewise, we may be able to exercise influence on what kind of policies and practices these institutions adopt, while that seems to be in their interests. But a regime change or a financially or politically motivated change of heart will see them turn on a dime. And you see that, I think, with the Google example, where they seem to have wrecked the functionality of their kind of core product. When it's to do with sponsorship for financial reasons, when it's to do with AI, absolutely no idea what the reasoning is. It seems to be baffling to me. Probably financial as well at some level, but I don't really get it. But in any case, we see these institutions kind of go bad. And the question for Robin is, why take a less cynical view than this? As Robin characterizes ideal epistemology. It makes idealizations about the capacities of individual agents, but it also makes idealizations about institutions, in particular capacities to, as Robin puts it, produce and disseminate knowledge. And I think it's clear enough that Robin isn't idealizing individuals. As we said, he kind of beats up on individuals pretty badly. He's not making idealizing assumptions about them. It's less clear to me that he's not in some ways idealizing the picture of institutions. Maybe not so much the capacities of institutions in some sense to shape our epistemic environments in a positive direction to help produce and disseminate knowledge, but idealizing on whether they will in fact exercise what capacities they have to do so. And if our epistemic fortunes are so heavily tied up with institutions to improve our epistemic environments, I think non-ideal inquiry epistemology needs to have realistic expectations about whether our institutions in fact deliver the goods, whether they in fact shape our epistemic environments in an epistemically productive direction. And so I want to circle back to the issue of the last talk and the issue that I said I started out with. I wanted to give an answer to the question that McKenna asks. I think, as I said, perhaps rhetorically, but I'm not sure, why value intellectual autonomy as striving for it means that one misses out on epistemic goods. I think we can see the beginnings of a kind of response in what I've just been talking about. One kind of response says intellectual autonomy can offer, perhaps in light of what we've already said, very limited, but some kind of protection for individuals who are in societies largely shaped by malevolent institutions, those who are largely facing hostile epistemic environments. And I think in the cases of societies which have largely epistemically benevolent institutions, but where that benevolence is fragile in the way I've talked about, you can see epistemic autonomy as giving a kind of insurance policy. So it might be worth striving for even a little bit of epistemic autonomy, even if striving in that way means you're going to miss out on some truths and some knowledge, because being entirely at the mercy of choice architects and other people who are kind of manipulating you and other institutions that are manipulating you in various ways leaves you profoundly epistemically vulnerable in a way which I think is very undesirable. Very quickly, two proposals that I floated that I think the non-ideal inquiry epistemologist can consider in this respect. One is something that Robin suggests himself without, I think, really endorsing it. It's the idea that we can use techniques like nudges, these kind of ways of shaping people's beliefs in predictable ways, where it kind of, in some sense, maybe bypasses or subverts their epistemic agency. We can do that in ways which actually help them to end up in a place where they are able to develop their intellectual autonomy. So, for example, when we are the choice architects, or when we can persuade the people who are to arrange things in particular ways, we can try and use that influence to undermine the influence that other choice architects and other manipulators will have on individuals. So we can use our influence now to help other people have less influence in the future. And then I think another strategy would be to look at the kinds of educational techniques that Alessandra Tanazzini has promoted in various works, but in particular at the end of her book, The Mismeasure of the Self. That are meant to be strategies for reducing individuals' susceptibility to motivated reasoning. So again, that'd be a strategy which gives the individual a bit of a capacity to avoid being kind of pulled by motivated reasoning in the way that Robin worries about. Putting these kind of suggestions into practice at any kind of scale means having a certain level of power, a certain level of influence over our institutions that we often may not have. We just might not have the capacity individually or collectively to shape our institutions in these ways, to put in practice widespread educational techniques, or to nudge in kind of directions that are going to increase the autonomy of individuals. but that's precisely the point now. The idea is that during windows when we do exercise such influence, windows when we have more control or more power or more influence, we might want to expend some of that influence, not just on enabling individuals to access truth and knowledge while the sun is shining, but to put those individuals in a slightly more resilient position when the rain inevitably comes. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Aidan. Robin, take it away.
Thanks, Aidan. So I don't know how common this is, but I often find that by the time that I've actually got something out in print, I've actually abandoned it, or at least come to realize things are more complicated than I thought. So that's sort of happened here. But I do think that a lot of what I say in the book can be defended against Aidan's criticisms. Actually, I'm not that invested in defending some of it because I want to take some of the points that Aidan was making on board. I'll do two things in the response. So first of all, push back and then say what my current picture is, which actually is different from what I said in the book. First of all, so I know that Aidan's a very careful reader, so something that I wanted to be clear in the book must not have been clear at all, which is that while chapters 3 to 5 are meant to be a defense of institutional epistemology, it's not meant to be a blanket defense of all institutions, and it's not meant to be a kind of attempt to illustrate a general claim about how I think institutions work via a particular example. It's rather meant to be a defense of, I guess, one institution, science, and the role that it might play in constructing a better epistemic environment, so to speak. And by science, I guess I kind of wanted to narrow that down a bit further to kind of, what we regard as like good scientific institutions as opposed to dodgy ones. But anyway, the idea was that I wanted to focus on a particular example, not because I wanted to establish a general claim about institutions or a general optimistic picture of them, but because I wanted to focus on a particular example. So if you like, the methodology of the book is much more case-by-case driven than the kind of methodology that wants to establish general claims. So I didn't take myself to be giving a general defense of institutions. That said, I think the book definitely adopted a pro-institutional science narrative. So that's something that I do need to defend. So let me just try and say something in defense of that. So the first thing is that these chapters were engaged in a particular project, which was to look at the literature in science communication, extract what I took to be the implicit, if you like, ethics of science communication that was in that literature, and then talk about whether that ethics is defensible. So basically, this picture says that when you've got a public-facing scientific institution, their task is to communicate with the public. The primary aim of those institutions should be to bring about that the public have more accurate, more rational attitudes on relevant scientific issues. So if they're climate change skeptics, they shouldn't be. If they're vaccine skeptics, they shouldn't be, and so on. So of course, in this implicit picture, it's quite clear there are meant to be constraints on this, right? So even if brainwashing worked, which it didn't, which it doesn't, you couldn't do that. But the idea is implicitly in this literature that you shouldn't worry too much about doing things that are subtly manipulative in the ways in which you might think nudges are subtly manipulative. You shouldn't worry about doing it in a way that, to use the terms from earlier, goes via the choice architecture. So in the book, I did want to defend this way of thinking about science communication with a proviso I'll mention in a second. So this is the stuff I said already. I wanted to say that, well, insofar as that's paternalistic, it's not the kind of paternalism we should be worried about. Insofar as it infringes on intellectual autonomy, we shouldn't be worried about that, because the kind of intellectual autonomy it infringes on isn't particularly important. So yeah, so I was defending those claims. But even there, I didn't take myself to be kind of giving a blanket defense of any conceivable science communication strategy. It was more, let's look at a set of strategies that have been proposed for bringing it about that the public has more rational attitudes about climate change and defending them. So I guess this wasn't clear at all based on your comments, but I didn't necessarily take it that that would extend to kind of other science communication contexts, because climate science, there's a couple of really salient features here that you wouldn't generally find in other contexts. So first of all, you've got near complete unanimity within the relevant community that climate change is a serious problem. So not just that it's real, but that it's a really serious problem for humankind. And second, this is a situation where the societal consequences of science skepticism are potentially really disastrous. And I think that kind of plays a role in some of the more consequentialist thinking in the chapter. So yeah, and I'm going to show how far I can narrow down the scope of the claims that I was defending. But certainly, I didn't want to give a blanket defense of institutions or defend a blanket kind of optimism at the level of institutions. At most, it was a kind of general optimism at the level of scientific institutions. But then again, the kind of question was, just because you think they're benevolent doesn't mean they can do whatever they want, because ways in which they might go about trying to achieve their aims might still be objectionable for certain reasons. Okay, so that's my attempt to defend what I say in the book. But yeah, I'm inclined to agree with quite a few of the things that you said, Aidan. In particular, your defense of intellectual autonomy. So what I've been working on for the past year is a paper on, if you like, cases where there is justified distrust of science and scientific expertise. Cases where people who lack relevant expert credentials not only refuse to simply defer to the experts, that is the credentialed experts, but plainly seem justified in refusing to do so. So healthcare, patient groups provide lots of examples of this. So I guess I wasn't quite thinking about this in terms of intellectual autonomy, but I could do if I wanted. And if I did that, what I would say is this. Insofar as this kind of justified science refusal manifests a kind of intellectual autonomy, it very much isn't this kind of having direction of your own inquiry sort of thing that Adam Carter is so worried about, or sorry, so concerned to defend. Rather, the idea is that when you get together with other like-minded people, you form a kind of group or collective. Within that group or collective, you kind of set the agenda, you kind of you exert a kind of intellectual autonomy at the level of the group. Essentially, in the sense in which you might think that individual scientists are intellectually autonomous in their activities as scientists, people that get together and do sort of lay research do a similar kind of thing. But again, this is going towards thinking about intellectual autonomy at the level of the group or a collective, and that individuals get to be intellectually autonomous insofar as they're a part of that collective, rather than viewing it as the sort of thing that an individual can go about trying to achieve by themselves. Because I just don't think that, yeah, but for the reasons I gave in the book, I just don't think that this way of thinking about it, where it's a kind of matter of you controlling what's going on epistemically, is a particularly important thing. And it's also, again, for the reasons I gave in the book, not possible anyway. But yeah, thanks.
All right, thanks. Ian, please.
Okay. I popped a handout into the chat for those of you who are here. So thank you very much, Robin, for a very interesting book. I want to continue Aidan's pessimism theme by focusing on the remarks that you make on epistemic vices. Now, I take it the one big picture claim that motivates non-ideal epistemology is the conviction that the world that we inhabit is very far from ideal, morally, socially, politically, epistemically. And it's a very welcome development in epistemology that people will turn towards this. And in chapter 7 of the book, you discuss one of the main areas of epistemology where this non-ideal sensitivity is coming through, which is vice epistemology. study of the vices of the mind, and I endorse the conviction that one of the important ways that we can think about what's non-ideal about the world is by thinking about the epistemic character failings of individuals and groups who have epistemic vices. The main suggestion I want to make is that maybe much of what you say about epistemic vices, our responsibility for them, can be enhanced if we think about the various ways in which social institutions, practices, and arrangements can encourage the development and the exercise of vices. And in particular, to think about the concept, as I've labeled it, of epistemic corruption. And I assume that human beings do have epistemic characters consisting of epistemic character traits, the traits that are positive and praiseworthy are the virtues, of course, and the character traits that are very bad are the vices. And vice epistemologists have been doing a lot of work over the last 20 or so years in describing these vices of the mind and taxonomizing them and relating them to the epistemic virtues. For example, you have a lot to say about Jose Medina, who's had a lot to say about how we might think about a socially situated, non-ideal virtue-vice epistemology. But I wonder whether there's more that you should say that would be helpful to you about the etiology of epistemic vices. Where did they come from? What sorts of factors encourage and sustain them? How do we explain the ways in which our epistemic character traits can change for the better or the worse? We had some discussion of this with autonomy. I mean, even if we want to endorse the idea that autonomy is a virtue, or at least an excellence of individuals, clearly many of our social epistemic environments are not conducive to the development of this. All your examples from the social epistemology of science about various forms of hostility towards science, from varieties of science denialism to attacks on climate scientists. There are clearly many, many ways in which our collective epistemic structures are hostile to virtuous epistemic agency and receptive to vicious epistemic agency. For example, I agree very much with the claim that you make that social positionality is going to influence the character traits and virtues and vices that we have. And you mentioned Medina's concept of the sociogenesis of the vices. And I suppose one of the things I want to know is, what would be a fuller account of this? In what ways does social positionality affect our epistemic character development? Could you tell us a fuller story about this? Partly because the story would be, of course, a very interesting one, opportunity to do some really good non-ideal epistemology. Partly because one of the important questions about virtues and vices is, how do we get more of the virtues and fewer of the vices? And also because it relates to the interesting things that you say about our responsibility, both for our epistemic activities and agency, but also for the virtues and vices that we have. And so my question is really, what would be a fuller story about the ways in which a non-ideal social world can affect our epistemic character for the worse? And the way I think about this is using this concept of corruption. So I've always thought it's very interesting that lots of non-ideal theorists will use a vocabulary of corruption when they talk about non-ideal social realities. So Miranda Fricker discusses the ways in which our epistemic character could be corrupted. Jose Medina uses the same language. So he thinks that if you're socialized into positions of social privilege, this will tend to be corrupting. It will encourage certain vices like arrogance and dogmatism. Alessandra Tonisini doesn't use the word corruption because I know that she dislikes it, but something like the same idea is there, a sensitivity to the idea that one of the ways in which a social environment can be non-ideal is that it is corrupting. It tends to weaken or displace our virtues and encourage or incentivize the vices. And I'm sure there are lots of very different ways that this could happen. Maybe some non-ideal conditions will force us to acquire vices that we didn't have before. Maybe I had no natural disposition to arrogance, but if I'm socialized in a certain way, I might come to develop that vice. Maybe in other cases, we might have latent vicious dispositions that are activated by our exposure to certain corrupting forces. And maybe other kinds of social conditions and influences can act on the vices that we already have. Maybe in some cases, our vices become intensified. Maybe I start off with a very mild arrogance that only shows up every now and again, but under certain kinds of conditions, that mild arrogance mutates into something much stronger until I end up with a raging epistemic hubris. Or maybe in other cases, certain social conditions will expand the scope of our vices. Maybe I was only ever arrogant about, I don't know, music, but over time I become arrogant about absolutely everything. Or maybe I have certain epistemic vices which sort of flicker on and off. They're kind of unstable. but over time, those vices stabilize into continuous traits. And I suppose this is one thing that non-ideal theorists could do with empirical scientists, so psychologists and sociologists, is to provide concrete cases about the ways, the actual ways in which individual agents can interact with social conditions in ways that affect their epistemic character for the worst. So when you talk about kind of shaping our character for the worst, what kind of story can we tell here? Is it social positionality? Is it temptations, incentives, structures, nudges? Is it an absence of exemplars of epistemic virtue from our environment? Or is it that epistemically virtuous people get attacked or marginalized or demeaned? Is it that our epistemic environment is full of exemplars of vice? Is being arrogant, dog-minded, and closed-minded rewarded and celebrated and praised? Think about those kinds of philosophy departments where being ruthless and aggressive in criticism is celebrated as a mark of a tough-minded thinker. I think those environments are corrupting as well. There are lots of ways in which a non-ideal environment could be epistemically corrupting. And it'd be interesting to know what you would think about expanding the account into something like an account of epistemic corruption. Two closing thoughts on this. At one point in that chapter, you talk about a forward-looking account of responsibility. And you ask, in a sense, quite optimistically about the kinds of persons we could become if our epistemic environments were changed or ameliorated in certain ways. And I wonder whether if we have an enhanced sensitivity to the fact that our epistemic environments are deeply epistemically corrupting, does this dampen our prospects going forward for thinking about the kinds of person we can become? I'm very inclined to a kind of pessimism and misanthropy. I think it's fantastically difficult to become and to remain a good person in such a hostile world when there are such structural temptations towards the vices of the mind and indeed the vices of the heart. If the world is very corrupting, is it even it's sensible to talk about responsibility for epistemic character traits? In many cases, our vices are down to our bad decisions and poor influences. But maybe in many cases, our epistemic vices are, if you like, done to us. We acquire them through long, slow processes of internalization. And I think here of work by Heather Battley and Lynn Terrell on the ways in which our epistemic environments are poisonous or toxic in ways that can entail damage to our epistemic character. Or, slightly more optimistically, what kinds of developmental possibilities will be available to epistemic agents like us, who are not only subject to corrupting forces, but who are also tired, busy, stressed, distracted, emotionally overwhelmed, living in a world full of disturbing phenomena, like the one coming up on Monday in the United States, a world where it's already fantastically difficult to be a good epistemic agent, let alone a virtuous one. In that kind of world, the world depicted by non-ideal epistemology, what are the serious prospects for our becoming anything like the epistemic agents that we read and write about in our papers? So what would be the character developmental realities in a non-ideal world? And then related to that, I suppose something I'd like to know about what you see as the big picture framing of non-ideal epistemology. And you mention many, many precedents for this. We have feminist virtue epistemologies like Miranda Fricker's or Nancy Dowcas's, the liberatory virtue theory of Battley and Tanassini. There's a variety I've called critical character epistemology. And I suppose one thing to ask is, well, going back to the pessimism-optimism question, what would you see as a sort of epistemic prognosis? Do you think that the world would become any less non-ideal? What would be the good strategies for this? You've mentioned education, but maybe education itself can be a primary vehicle of epistemic corruption. Do you think that there's a sort of fragility built into epistemic goodness, which partly makes sense in the context of a non-ideal world? Is there a background pessimism that might be lurking in the background of your account that you might want to bring forward, not to depress us, but because it captures some deep truth about the world? So much of what I say is, in a sense, a big thumbs up to what you want to say, but I'd like to hear more about the role of epistemic vices in the non-ideal picture you paint, and whether you think that there is a role for something like epistemic corruption in the way that you're thinking about virtues, vices, and non-ideal epistemology. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I was I was trying to scribble down some thoughts as you spoke to go with what I prepared earlier. So I guess what I'll do is what I prepared earlier, but then with some bits where I was just scribbling down in the last 5 minutes. Perhaps they'll be less well formed. So thanks, Ian. I took that to mostly be a helpful set of suggestions about the right direction for non-ideal epistemology. I think it's important to kind of be clear that the book is called Non-Ideal Epistemology, not because I think that it contains all the non-ideal epistemology, but because it starts by explaining what I mean by non-ideal epistemology, and then the rest of the book is just an example of that. But of course, there could be all sorts of other examples of that say things that are very different and tackle very different topics. So it wasn't meant to be the kind of book where you set the agenda in that way. Okay, so things I think we agree on. First of all, character epistemology as a maybe an improvement as a general framework on virtue epistemology. There's a remark you make, I don't think it was in what you just said, but it's in the paper that I'm going to come back to later about goodness being fragile, the badness not being fragile. I'll come back to that in a second. I think we agree about the need for a critical character epistemology. So in this relevant chapter of the book, chapter 7, I discussed people that you also discussed, like Robin Dillon, so examples of critical character epistemologists. So very much on board there. And I am very much on board about the interest of need to talk about epistemic corruption, so corrupting conditions in the context of a critical character epistemology. I agree about the importance of charting the ways in which conditions can corrupt character. It's not the kind of thing I'm personally very good at, to be honest. I'm not really very good at these kind of marvelous character sketches that people like you and Alessandra Tadasini are so good at. So I'll not be doing that myself, but I enthusiastically support you in doing it. Okay, so you seem to be making a couple of criticisms, again, both in a constructive way. So the first, so obviously you were saying that I didn't say enough about corruption in the book. I took that to be kind of a criticism in the sense of, given what I was discussing in chapter 7, Medina and so on, I should have done. Yeah, what do I think about this? Yeah, so kind of the half-baked thought I had was that while I agree with you about the importance of corruption, I'm not sure that I would quite think about it in the same way. So it seems to me, this was back to the remark about the non-fragility of badness. I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm more tempted to think that both badness and goodness are fragile. So I guess I would put it like this. The truth in situationism is that people can behave in very different ways depending on the context, right? You take one person, you put them in one context, you get one kind of behavior, a different context, you get very different behaviors. That's not because people don't have stable character traits. So that skepticism about character, I think, is completely unwarranted. But I think what it does show you is that there are all these contextual influences on behavior. So the way I'd think of it maybe more is that corruption is when you create an environment where it's harder to be good and easier to be bad. But that's not because it's necessarily doing that much when it comes to your underlying character traits. It's because it is incentivizing or producing certain kinds of behavior that we would regard as bad. So kind of more contextual approach, which means that I wouldn't necessarily be thinking about corruption in terms, or quite so closely in terms of character formation. So that's all kind of in terms of emphasis. Obviously, some people are bad, some people are good. We can talk about corruption and character, but I think it's a question of where you place the emphasis. I'm not sure that I would quite place the emphasis so strongly on corruption at the level of character. So that's kind of my response there. So the second thing, and this kind of connects up with what I was really trying to do in chapter 7. So your criticism here was that what I say about responsibility following Jose Medina might seem a bit optimistic, given that all this corruption is going on. Well, that's right in the sense that I don't say that much about corruption. I mean, but as an aside, it seems to me like actually Medina's picture is a bit more optimistic than yours. He tends to kind of emphasize the ways in which we can be made to be good and so on, whereas you want to emphasize the ways in which we can be bad, probably reflecting a dispositional difference. But what I thought was interesting about Medina's account of responsibility is that, as I interpreted it anyway, it's not actually tied to this. So what's interesting about Medina's account of responsibility is that he seems to want to detach your responsibilities from your character. So it's not that you've got a responsibility to be open-minded because you are somebody who was good at being open-minded. Rather, you've got this social division of epistemic responsibilities. You're somebody who has got a social role that requires open-mindedness. You're a teacher, you're a juror, whatever, and that means open-mindedness is expected of you, even though perhaps you're not very good at being open-minded. So this is interesting because it's a way of saying that somebody can be responsible for something independent of whether their character makes them the kind of person that is going to be able to do it. So incidentally, this is why I very much agree with you when you say that on a non-ideal character epistemology, you're moving away from traditional conceptions of virtue and vice, the idea that virtue goes with praise, vice with blame. So clearly, if that's the way in which, following Medina, you want to understand responsibility, praise and blame are not really the right reactive attitudes, right? So somebody is put into a social role where open-mindedness is expected. They're habitually closed-minded. It doesn't seem like blame is the right reactive attitude there. So this is just a way of thinking about responsibility where it's not tied to those reactive attitudes at all. So that very much is a different way of thinking about it. I was trying to think about other possible areas of disagreement between you and myself. And I guess one thing that I did do a lot of in the book is talk about corruption in a different way, where I'm doing a lot of stuff based on psychology, human biases, all that kind of stuff. And I guess the way the psychologists think about that is that for evolutionary reasons, humans have got this set of biases because this set of biases were helpful for navigating our environment. So that's like maybe a kind of corruption, but it's a very different kind of corruption, right? Because it's not as if you made the social environment better, those kinds of failings would go away. They would remain because they're kind of inbuilt cognitive tendencies that psychologists presume are kind of relatively evenly shared amongst human beings. So I guess I did see my book as having this pessimistic streak, but that was a pessimism that was based more on that rather than on the ways in which particular social environments can corrupt. I don't know if that's really an area of disagreement or rather just a kind of place where I put emphasis, but that's where I think the pessimistic streak in the book was coming from. But anyway, yeah, those are some thoughts in response to your comments. Thanks.